Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that I think a lot of you out there are probably wrestling with, and that's how to really take control of your careers. And I mean, really take control while also, not totally sacrificing your well being in the process, especially, in the kind of crazy work world we're all navigating these days. And to help us sort through all this, we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating book, Betting on You by Laurie Ruettimann.
And I think this is so timely because, think about it. If you're feeling stuck, which I think a lot of us do at some point,
Yeah.
right? Or just overwhelmed by, the constant demands of work and life, or maybe you just want to be more intentional about, shaping a career that really lights you up. Well, this is for you. We're going beyond just, the typical book summary here. We're really digging into the most useful strategies and insights that you can actually put to work.
Exactly. And Ruettimann's background is what makes this so compelling. I mean, she's got this deep experience in HR, spent time at Pfizer, which, as you know, is a huge player in the corporate world. And she's taken all that experience and kind of created what she calls a 21st century employee handbook. But forget about boring, corporate jargon. This book is actually really engaging. It's got some surprising perspectives in there too. I mean, she really gets into how you can prioritize your well-being, which we all talk about, but how do we actually do it right, and how to take smart risks in your career, not just jump ship blindly, how to build a real community, not just, a bunch of LinkedIn connections, and ultimately how to become, like she says, the architect of your own career and life. I mean, that's a powerful idea, right?
It is. It is. And our mission here, in this deep dive is really simple. We want to pull out the most powerful, actionable stuff from this book. The insights and strategies that will make you a more effective, I guess you could say a more savvy navigator of your own career path. But most importantly, we want you to walk away from this really understanding how to make your well-being a non-negotiable, not just something you squeeze in when you have time.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get into it. So the book kind of starts off by painting this pretty stark picture of what Rodiman calls, and it's a great phrase, the broken state of work. It's not all, catered lunches and ping pong tables and unlimited vacation days, right? I mean, she's really drawing on her own time in HR, right? To highlight just how messed up. She even uses the phrase borderline toxic many workplaces actually are.
And I think what's so powerful about this is it's that insider perspective, right? She's not an outsider looking in. She's been in the trenches. And so when she talks about things like unresolved conflicts, those things that just fester, right? Or communication breakdowns where crucial information gets lost in a sea of Slack messages and ignored emails. I mean, does that sound familiar to anybody out there? Oh, no, it does to me. And then, of course, there's the whole minefield of office politics, the colleagues who, maybe aren't the most open-minded, and that constant underlying anxiety about, speaking up, rocking the boat, and maybe upsetting the powers that be. I mean, it's really, really relatable to, I think, a lot of people's experience.
It is. And she makes this, I thought it was a brilliant point about the democratization of demoralization, which is, it's not just one sector of the workforce that's feeling the strain anymore. Like it used to be, oh, blue collar jobs, those are the tough ones, and white collars sitting in an office, you're fine. She's saying, no, that's not true anymore. Whether you're, working with your hands or, navigating this complex corporate world, those core frustrations, the bad boss, the career that's going nowhere, the feeling that you're not being paid what you're worth, those are actually pretty universal experiences now.
And I think if you zoom out even further, right, it really points to this bigger issue. This isn't just about, individuals messing up or not trying hard enough. It's often about, the systems and the structures within workplaces themselves. So if you're feeling this way, I just want to say you are not alone. And I think that's where Ruettimann offers this really, I guess you could say, a sense of hope. This idea that by really understanding these dynamics, these sort of unspoken rules of the game, you can actually either significantly improve your current situation, make it better, or if you need to, right, you can make a more informed decision to, go find something else that's a better fit, something that's more aligned with your values, with what you want.
Right. So, having laid out this, kind of less than ideal reality, right? The book really shifts to the central theme of betting on yourself. And I think it's important to emphasize that she means this in a much broader sense than just your career, your job title. She's really talking about the absolute necessity of putting your physical, emotional, and financial well-being at the very center of your life. Not at the periphery, but at the center.
Yeah, and it's such a crucial reframe because so many of us, right? I mean, we've been conditioned to believe that our job title is like our identity. It's who we are. And she's really challenging that and saying, hold on a second. Think about all the other roles you play in life. Are you a thinker, a learner, a parent, a partner, a friend? I mean, all of those things are part of who you are. And she introduces this idea of a hashtag human statement, which is a way to articulate your identity in a more holistic way, right? It's
Yeah.
not just about your job title. It's about, capturing the essence of who you are as a human being. So, for example, you could say, I'm a creative problem solver who values connection and continuous growth, both personally and professionally. Something like that.
Yeah. I love that. And she also has this really important caution about, getting too caught up in these career identity statements, especially when they lead to comparison, right? Which we all do. She even calls comparison, and I think this is so true, the thief of joy. And it's so easy, right? Especially now with social media and everything, to constantly be comparing ourselves to other people's highlight reels and feeling like we're not enough. And so the book really encourages you to shift that focus inward to really cultivate a sense of well-being that's rooted in your whole life, not just your professional accomplishments.
Yeah. And I think that leads really well to another point she makes, which I found so interesting. She actually re-examines the whole idea of slackerism, which, in our culture is a bad word, right? But she makes this really crucial distinction between being, what she calls negatively obsessed with work. You're putting in these long hours, you're constantly stressed, but you're not actually being productive. You're just kind of spinning your wheels versus consciously protecting your time and energy. And she introduces this, I thought this was a really provocative idea. She calls it giving your best 72% at work. Which at first sounds like, wait, are you saying we should be slacking off? But it's not about that. It's about being strategic with your energy, right?
Yeah.
So that you can be sustainable. So you're not burning out. You have energy left for the rest of your life, for your family, for your hobbies, for things that actually matter. So what do you think about that idea of best 72%? Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely counterintuitive, right? Because we're all kind of conditioned to think we have to be on all the time. But the underlying principle, I think, is really sound, which is, sustainability. You just
Yeah.
can't operate at 100% all the time without crashing and burning. And, speaking of well-being, the book dives into this really interesting section called the self-care trap. And it starts with this funny anecdote about her husband who, is a PhD chemical engineer. So, very smart guy, but he had absolutely no idea what self-care even meant. Like the phrase just, it didn't register.
Right. And that really highlights how this term, which, we throw around all the time now, has become so mainstream, it can still be completely foreign to some people. But her point is a serious one, which is
Right.
that true self-care isn't about buying into this, huge self-care economy that's out there. It's not about, the latest face mask or, that expensive yoga retreat, right?
Exactly. She defines real self-care as just prioritizing your well-being. It's about giving yourself permission to slack off in the sense of slowing down, really
Yeah.
focusing on your mental and physical health, disconnecting from, the constant demands and notifications. And she's really critical of how this self-care economy sometimes preys on our insecurities, makes us feel like we need to buy our way to feeling better.
And I think what's really valuable here is her emphasis on the cost-free,
Mm.
foundational elements of well-being.
Mhm.
So things like, your relationships, your community, getting enough sleep, eating well, disconnecting from screens. I mean, these are the things that truly nourish us, and they don't require you to spend a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I thought was so interesting in the book was this concept of taking risks thoughtfully. And she introduces this idea through a very personal and kind of dramatic story about her own experience with bariatric surgery. And she actually had this surgery done in Tijuana, Mexico.
Wow, yeah. That's quite a story. I mean, her decision to go to Mexico for surgery, which, was driven by weight gain from a very stressful job, and then all the risks involved. I mean, she even mentions getting warnings about potential kidnappings. It's a pretty intense story. And then the procedure itself, which surprisingly went very smoothly, and then the unaccepted bribe, it all ties into this theme of, assessing risks, but then taking action, like not letting fear paralyze you.
It does, yeah. And from there, she introduces this concept of the premortem. And this is so fascinating. It's basically this idea of proactively thinking about how you might fail before you even start something, like a project or a big decision. And it's all about identifying potential pitfalls and coming up with solutions in advance. And she credits this technique to Dr. Gary Klein, who's, kind of a pioneer in cognitive psychology.
I love this idea. It's like, a fire drill for your life.
Yeah.
And she actually gives some great examples of how we might already be doing this unconsciously in our everyday lives. Like, think about families, maybe those that are a little bit more a little bit more dysfunctional, they can often predict, like, who's going to argue with who at a holiday gathering,
Right.
because they've seen it before.
Right. And she's also really honest about her own experience with her failed startup, Glitchpath, and how, maybe if they'd done a better job of this premortem, they might have been able to avoid some of the pitfalls that ultimately led to its demise. It's a good reminder that even with great ideas and, solid execution, if you're not thinking about what could go wrong, that can be a huge blind spot.
So how do you actually do this premortem thing effectively? Well, according to the book, it starts with identifying what she calls your secret dreams. So the things that really motivate you. And then you kind of do this thought experiment. You imagine that you've failed to achieve those dreams, and then you brainstorm all the reasons why that might have happened, no matter how, unlikely or even irrational they seem. And this list then becomes your to-do list. It helps you identify potential obstacles and, more importantly, helps you create pathways to success by addressing those fears head on. It's about failing forward, but doing it before you even start.
That's so smart. Yeah, I love that. And, you can't really navigate risk effectively if you haven't honestly thought through what could go wrong. Okay, so the book then shifts gears and tackles a topic that I think is just a huge source of anxiety for a lot of people, and that's money. She calls the section Fixing Your Money. And she starts with this very, direct statement that just can't be argued with, and that is you can't quit your job if you're broke. It's the truth, isn't it? I mean, financial insecurity can be a real trap, and it can force you to stay in jobs that are, maybe not good for you or even toxic, simply because you don't have the financial freedom to leave. And then she gets into this really interesting critique of executive compensation, and the hypocrisy of these highly paid executives lecturing the rest of us on, the importance of budgeting and saving when they're making millions. And she has this great example of a COO giving this incredibly out-of-touch financial advice that just shows how disconnected some leaders are from the reality of most people's lives.
Yeah, it's a great anecdote. It really highlights that disconnect, right? And that actually was part of what motivated her to, transition into freelance consulting herself. She talks about the financial uncertainties of that, the challenges of, starting a business, the ups and downs, the unexpected expenses, those lean months. It's not all glamorous, right?
Yeah.
It's not. And then she contrasts that with Dawn's story, which is a really inspiring example of the power of paying yourself first. And the idea here is that even if you're not making a lot of money, you prioritize saving a little bit from each paycheck. It's about building that foundation for financial freedom over time.
So what are some of the practical things she recommends for getting your finances in order?
Well, she talks about finding a good financial advisor, someone you can trust, and then using tools, budgeting tools. She specifically mentions QuickBooks to really get a handle on your income and expenses. And then, this is a great phrase. She talks about ending those Fortune 500 tastes on a Ruettimann budget, which is, basically aligning your spending with your actual income, not the income you wish you had. Yeah, love that. And then, a crucial part of this is learning to negotiate your worth, like really asking for more when it comes to salary, benefits, opportunities. She calls it adopting a CEO mindset, approaching those conversations with confidence, backing up your requests with data, and understanding that negotiation is just a normal part of business, not a personal attack. She also talks about creating a brag book, which is basically a document where you keep track of all your wins, all your accomplishments, positive feedback. And this is something you can then use during performance reviews and compensation discussions.
And she also gets into the really tough stuff, like financial hardship. She shares her own father's story, which is a cautionary tale about the dangers of not saving and ending up, vulnerable to predatory lending practices. And she even contrasts this with, Donald Trump's multiple bankruptcies. And it really highlights the different realities, right? The different safety nets that exist for people at different income levels.
Yeah, and that really underscores how important it is to build your own financial resilience, regardless of where you are right now.
So the book then moves into, I think this is one of the most encouraging sections, which is about the power of learning and mentorship. And she actually cites this Harvard Business Review study that found that employees who actively learn at work, they actually report feeling less stressed and anxious.
Which, kind of goes against what we might think, right? Like, oh, learning, that's just extra work. But it actually shows that learning is not just about, getting ahead or adding skills to your resume. It's actually a tool for, for managing stress, for staying engaged, and finding more meaning in your work. And the book shares some really inspiring stories here, like Beth, who, was feeling really burned out as a vet tech. But then she started learning this new specialized skill, and it totally reignited her passion for her work. And then Samantha, who's just bored, in her job, But then she took on this new role that was more mentally challenging, and it made all the difference.
Yeah, I love those stories. And Ruettimann even recommends this 30-day learning challenge for her clients who are, feeling kind of stuck or uninspired. And it's basically about committing to some small, focused learning activity every day just to kind of, spark your curiosity and build some momentum. And she also emphasizes how important it is to seek out feedback, even when it's hard to hear. And she tells this funny story about getting some really direct feedback on her own table manners, which, I'm sure wasn't fun to hear, but ultimately helped her.
Yeah, I think those personal touches really make the advice so much more relatable. And in the story of John, who successfully used the pre-mortem technique in sales, it really shows how these concepts can be applied across different fields.
Yeah.
And I think the section on mentorship is especially powerful.
It is. Yeah, the story of Bella, who had this really unfortunate ass bag incident, and how her mentor, Nancy, really helped her, navigate that situation and learn from it. And ultimately, Bella ended up getting promoted, which is fantastic. And then Ruettimann even talks about Susie Welch as her own unofficial mentor, which just shows that mentorship can come in many forms, right?
It does. It can be a formal relationship, or it can be just learning from someone you admire, even from afar.
So the book then moves into this really empowering idea of taking control and being your own HR. And this really ties into the whole, self-reliance theme of the book. And Ruettimann shares this pretty wild story about witnessing some seriously inappropriate behavior at work. We're talking people having sex in the office. And it was just this wake-up call for her that ultimately, when it comes to your well-being and your career, you are the one who has to look out for yourself. Like, no one else is going to do it for you.
That's such a powerful message, and it's kind of sobering, too. And she's really honest about the limitations of traditional HR departments. They're not always there to help you, and sometimes they even have their own agendas. So she really encourages you to define your own metrics for success, to make decisions that are aligned with your values, not just, following the company line or whatever HR tells you to do.
Yeah, and she gives some really great tips for doing a proactive job search. She calls it being a secret job search spy, which I love. And she talks about the importance of networking, both online and offline, and really using LinkedIn effectively. And even when you do get a new job, she talks about, onboarding yourself like a boss, like setting up Google alerts to stay informed, building relationships with key people early on. It's about taking ownership of your experience, not just waiting for the company to, hold your hand and walk you through everything.
Yeah, and she really emphasizes this idea of running your life like a leader, defining your goals, understanding how your work fits into your bigger life story. And that kind of leads naturally into the section on navigating job transitions.
Right. And one of the first things she advises is to keep your job search completely confidential while you're still employed, which is just, common sense, but it's easy to forget that.
It is. You don't want to jeopardize your current position.
Yeah.
And she gives some great tips for identifying those dream companies, the ones that are really a good fit for you. And then doing your due diligence, going beyond just the company website, looking at online reviews, checking out people's profiles on LinkedIn, really getting a sense of the culture. And again, networking, reaching out to people for informational interviews, but doing it confidentially.
And then when it comes to actually interviewing, she talks about, interviewing like a champion, being an active participant, presenting yourself well. She even has this thing called the Oprah test, which is, would you be comfortable with this version of yourself being seen on, national TV? And just, being present, being engaged in the conversation. And then, waiting to hear back, which is always the hardest part. She talks about this mindset of being smart and squishy, which I think is such a great phrase. It's about knowing what you can control, what you can't, and just staying sane through the process.
Yeah. And then when you get the offer, she walks you through how to negotiate effectively. When to push back, when to accept, and also when to walk away. Like if the environment's toxic, if your values don't align, or if you just feel demeaned, those are deal breakers.
Absolutely. And then she even tackles the really tricky question of quitting a job without having another one lined up, which, can be scary. She shares her own parents' perspective on that, which was very much against it. And then this cautionary tale of Helen, who, things didn't work out so well for her. But she also talks about the possibility of negotiating a severance package, sharing Tamra's success story and explaining why companies sometimes are willing to do that. It can be a win-win.
Yeah, and I think it all comes back to, that core principle of remembering that a job is just a job.
Yeah.
And that your well-being, your values, those things come first. And she illustrates that so well with Rachel's story, who got fired unexpectedly, but it actually turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her.
Yeah, sometimes these things happen for a reason. And finally, the book ends on this really uplifting note, which is about small steps to big change. And she emphasizes how powerful it can be to just try one new thing, outside of work, to kind of shift your perspective, broaden your horizons. She gives examples like, taking a cooking class, reading for fun, volunteering.
Yeah, it's about those little things that can make a big difference in your overall well-being and help you break out of that, work-obsessed mindset that can be so easy to get trapped in. And she also talks about the importance of building real connections at work, like the friendship she had with Lars, and really defining your own sense of purpose in your work.
She shares this great exercise that Layla did where she actually wrote down all the reasons why she works, the benefits she gets from it, and then she created a personal work statement. It's a great exercise for anyone to do. And, she also offers this really important reminder that sometimes providing for your family, being a good colleague, that's enough. Like, not every job has to be this, grand world-changing mission.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Sometimes just being helpful and reliable is a perfectly valid and fulfilling purpose.
So to kind of wrap things up for you, the main message of betting on you is really clear. You have the power to take control of your career, your well-being, by putting yourself first.
And there are some things you can do, like right now. Maybe identify one small thing you can do outside of work that brings you joy. Take some time to really reflect on how you define yourself professionally and how that impacts your overall sense of self. And maybe try applying that pre-mortem technique to a challenge you're facing right now. Just think through those potential roadblocks and come up with some solutions in advance.
And remember, this is a journey. There's no finish line. And if you want to dive deeper into these ideas, we highly recommend checking out the book's website, bettingonyourbook.com. They have tons of resources, conversation starters, checklists, action plans. And if you want to hear more from Laurie Ruettimann herself, you can find information about her speaking engagements at laurieruettimann.com/speaking.
So, as you go about your day-to-day, think about this. What's one aspect of your work experience, whether it's how you approach your tasks, how you manage your time, how you interact with colleagues, that you're going to take ownership of starting right now? Like, what's one thing you're going to change, regardless of what your company's policies are or what your boss says? It's about taking that first step toward really betting on yourself.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.